When my daughter died, my son-in-law inherited $228 million and kicked me out, saying, "Now I have nothing to do with you. Take your old clothes and live on the street." My lawyer took a sip of water and said, "First, read the will to the end. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from." The smell of funeral flowers still clung to my clothes when Donald threw me out of my own daughter's house. 3 hours. That's how long he waited after we buried Zoey before showing me who he really was. "Pack your things, old man. You have 30 minutes." I stood in the marble foyer of the house I had helped buy for my daughter, watching this man I thought I knew transform into someone unrecognizable. Donald's face, which had been a mask of grief all week, now twisted with something ugly. Something that had been hiding beneath the surface for years. "Donald, what are you talking about?" My voice cracked. I was 57 years old, and I felt every one of those years pressing down on me. "This is Zoey's house, our family home." He laughed, actually laughed. The sound echoed off the high ceilings like broken glass. "Your family?" He stepped closer, and I caught the smell of whiskey on his breath. "Thomas, you stopped being family the day Zoey realized what a disappointment you were as a father." The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the banister to steady myself, my legs suddenly weak. "She never said that. Zoey never what? Never told you the truth?" Donald's eyes gleamed with a cruelty I had never seen before. He was too kind, too soft, always making excuses for you. But I know what she really thought. My mind reeled back to the funeral that morning. Zoey's friends and colleagues had offered their condolences, but something felt off. The way they looked at me, the way conversations stopped when I approached, I had attributed it to grief, to the awkwardness that surrounds death. Now I wondered if there was something else. "What did you tell them?" I whispered. Donald smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. "I told them the truth about what kind of father abandons his daughter when she needs him most. I never abandoned her. When she was sick last year, I was there every day at the hospital." "Were you?" Donald interrupted. "Or were you there for the first few days until it became inconvenient? Until you had to get back to your precious work?" The accusation stunned me into silence. Zoey had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition 14 months ago. I had taken time off from my consulting firm, spending 2 weeks by her bedside until she was stable. When the doctors said she was improving and suggested I return to work to maintain normalcy, I had reluctantly agreed. But I visited every evening. I called twice a day, didn't I? The doubt crept in like poison. Had I been there enough? Had I failed her when she needed me most? "I can see it in your face," Donald said softly, his voice almost gentle now. "The doubt. Good. You should doubt yourself, Thomas, because while you were busy with your meetings and your clients, I was the one holding her hand through every treatment. I was the one who stayed awake with her during the bad nights. I was the one she turned to when she was scared." Tears stung my eyes. "She was my daughter, my only child." "Was," Donald emphasized. Past tense. "And now she's gone. And frankly, she doesn't need you anymore. Neither do I." He walked past me toward the kitchen, and I followed like a lost dog. The house felt different now. Foreign. The family photos on the walls seemed to mock me. In every picture, I noticed for the first time how Donald's arm was always around Zoey, how she leaned into him, how natural they looked together. When had I stopped being in the center of these moments? "The inheritance is mine now," Donald continued, opening a bottle of champagne. The pop of the cork felt obscene so soon after the funeral. $228 million. Zoey's trust fund, her investments, this house, the vacation home in Martha's Vineyard, all of it. My breath caught. I knew Zoey had money from the trust her grandmother had left her, but I had no idea it had grown to such an enormous sum. And now it was all in the hands of this man who was drinking champagne on the day we buried her. "She would have wanted some of that to go to charities she cared about," I said weakly. "The children's hospital where she volunteered." "Would she?" Donald took a long sip of champagne. "Because according to her will, she left it all to me, every penny, which tells me exactly what she thought about her dear old dad's opinions." He reached into a manila folder on the kitchen counter and pulled out official-looking documents. Even from across the room, I could see my daughter's signature on the bottom of several pages. You want to know what else she left instructions about? Donald's voice dropped to a whisper. She specifically stated that you were not to inherit anything. Not the house, not money, not even her jewelry. Nothing. The kitchen tilted around me. I gripped the marble counter, my knuckles white. That's not possible. Zoey loved me. We had our problems, but she loved me. Did she? Donald set down his glass and fixed me with a stare that chilled me to the bone. Or did you just tell yourself that to make the guilt easier to live with? He walked to the back door and opened it wide, the October wind rushing in and bringing the smell of dying leaves. Your 30 minutes are up, Thomas. Take whatever clothes you can carry and get out. And don't even think about contesting the will. Zoey made sure it was ironclad. I stood there for a moment longer, hoping this was some kind of nightmare I would wake up from. But the cold air on my face was real. The documents in Donald's hand were real. The cruel satisfaction in his eyes was real. With shaking hands, I gathered a few belongings from the guest room where I had been staying since Zoey's death. My clothes, some photographs, my father's watch, everything else, the life I thought I had, the relationship I thought I understood, it was all gone. As I reached the front door, Donald called out one last time. Oh, and Thomas, don't bother trying to contact me. I'm changing the locks tonight. This family has moved on without you. I walked to my car in a daze, my arms full of hastily packed bags. Neighbors peered from their windows, and I wondered what story Donald would tell them. What story he had already been telling them. As I drove away from the house where I had spent countless holidays and family dinners, where I had watched my daughter grow into a successful woman, one thought consumed me. Had I really been such a terrible father that Zoey wanted me erased from her life entirely? The doubt was eating me alive, and somewhere in the back of my mind a voice whispered that maybe Donald was right. Maybe I deserved this. Maybe I had failed her in ways I was too blind to see. I had nowhere to go and no one to call. For the first time in my 57 years, I was completely alone. The homeless shelter on Beacon Street smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. 3 weeks after Donald threw me out, this was my reality. A cot between a man who talked to invisible people and another who coughed all night, his lungs rattling like broken machinery. I stared at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the symphony of snores and whispers around me. 57 years old, and this was where I had ended up. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had once donated to this very shelter during my company's charity drives. Now I was grateful for the lukewarm soup they served twice a day. My consulting business had collapsed within a week of Zoey's death. When you disappear for 2 weeks without warning, clients don't stick around. The few who called got my voicemail, and eventually, they stopped calling altogether. The office lease was up for renewal, and without income, I had let it go. 23 years of building a business, gone. You're new to this, said Marcus, the man on the cot next to mine. He was maybe 40, with kind eyes and the weathered face of someone who had spent too many nights outdoors. The look on your face, I know it well. I turned toward him. What look? The look of someone who still thinks this is temporary. Like you're going to wake up tomorrow and your old life will be waiting for you. His words stung because they were true. Every morning I expected to get a call from someone, anyone, telling me this had all been a mistake, that Donald had found another will, that Zoey had left me something, that my daughter had really loved me after all. But the calls never came. How long have you been here? I asked. 2 years this time, on and off for 5. Marcus sat up on his cot, his movements careful and practiced. Lost my job when the factory closed. Wife left, took the kids, tried to drink the pain away, and here I am. At least Marcus knew why his life had fallen apart. I was still trying to piece together how I had gotten here. Every day, fragments of memories surfaced, moments with Zoey that I had interpreted one way, but now seemed to tell a different story. Last Christmas, for instance, I had arrived at their house with expensive gifts, a pearl necklace for Zoey, a vintage watch for Donald. But when Zoey opened the jewelry box, her smile had seemed forced. She had hugged me, but her body was stiff, formal. "Dad, you didn't need to spend so much," she had said. At the time, I thought she was being modest. Now I wondered if she was telling me something else entirely. That money couldn't buy back the time I hadn't spent with her. That expensive gifts couldn't replace a father's presence. "Tell me about her," Marcus said quietly. Somehow he had sensed I was thinking about Zoey. So I did. I told him about the little girl who used to wake me up early on Saturday mornings, begging me to make pancakes in the shape of animals. I told him about the teenager who had called me crying from college when her boyfriend broke up with her, and how I had driven 4 hours to bring her ice cream and terrible jokes. "She sounds like she loved you," Marcus said when I finished. "Then why did she cut me out? Why did she leave everything to him?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe the question isn't why she left you out. Maybe the question is when she started feeling like she had to." His words followed me for days. When she started feeling like she had to, I began to remember things differently, looking for signs I had missed. The phone calls that grew shorter over the past 2 years, the canceled dinners, the times she would start to tell me something and then stop, saying, "Never mind," with a sad smile. I had always attributed it to her busy life, her marriage, the natural way adult children separate from their parents. But now I wondered if Donald had been working behind the scenes, slowly poisoning her against me. I started making lists in my head of the changes I had noticed in Zoey, how she had become more anxious, more withdrawn, how she had started second-guessing herself constantly, asking Donald's opinion about everything, how she had stopped talking about her volunteer work at the children's hospital, something she had been passionate about for years. One afternoon, while standing in line for the free lunch program at St. Mary's Church, I overheard 2 women talking. "Did you hear about that poor woman who died? Zoey Crawford. Such a tragedy." My ears perked up. I moved closer, pretending to read the community bulletin board. "I knew her from the hospital volunteer program," the first woman continued. "Sweet girl. But something changed in her this past year. She seemed scared all the time." "Scared of what?" "I don't know. But she stopped coming to our volunteer meetings. When I called to check on her, she said her husband thought she was doing too much, that she needed to focus on her health." My blood ran cold. Zoey had loved volunteering at the children's hospital. It was something she had started in college and continued throughout her adult life. She used to tell me stories about the kids she worked with, how reading to them brightened their days during treatment. When had she stopped, and why hadn't I noticed? "The husband seems nice enough," the second woman said. "Very devoted, always with her at the hospital during her treatments." "Maybe too devoted," the first woman replied quietly. "My daughter went through chemo 2 years ago, and I was there every day, but I still encouraged her to maintain her independence, her friendships. This Donald fellow, he seemed to want to control everything. Who could visit when they could visit what the doctors could tell her directly?" I felt sick. Had Donald been isolating Zoey systematically, making her dependent on him while pushing everyone else away? That night, I called information and got the number for Zoey's best friend from college, Sarah, who lived in Portland. We hadn't spoken in years, but she would remember me. "Thomas," Sarah's voice was thick with emotion when she answered. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry about Zoey. I wanted to come to the funeral, but Donald said it was immediate family only." Immediate family only? "Sarah, you were like a sister to her." "I know, it hurt, but he said Zoey had specifically requested a small service. He said she didn't want her friends to see her that way, that she wanted to be remembered as she was." Another lie? Another way Donald had controlled the narrative, even in death. "Sarah, when did you last talk to Zoey?" "About 6 months ago. She called me crying, said she missed our friendship, but that things were complicated." I tried to get her to explain, but she kept saying she couldn't talk about it, that Donald was right and she was just being emotional because of her medication. Medication. Another piece of the puzzle. What medication? For her autoimmune condition or something else? Did she seem like herself to you? Sarah was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally she whispered, "No." She seemed like someone pretending to be Zoey, like she was reading from a script. After I hung up, I sat on my cot in the shelter and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Anger. Not at myself this time, but at Donald. At the way he had systematically destroyed my relationship with my daughter. At the way he had isolated her from her friends, her passions, maybe even from herself. But anger wasn't enough. I needed proof. I needed to understand exactly what Donald had done to Zoey and why, and I needed to figure out if there was any way to get justice for my daughter. Because for the first time since her death, I was beginning to suspect that Zoey's will wasn't the final word after all. The coffee shop on Commonwealth Avenue had been Zoey's favorite. I remembered bringing her here when she was 12, after her mother died. She would order hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, and we would sit by the window, watching people pass by as I tried to figure out how to raise a daughter alone. Now I sat in that same window seat, nursing a cup of coffee I couldn't afford, waiting for Dr. Elena Rodriguez. She had been Zoey's doctor at Massachusetts General, and when I called her office, something in her voice told me she had been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. "Mr. Patterson," she said as she slid into the seat across from me. Dr. Rodriguez was a small woman with intelligent eyes and prematurely gray hair. "I'm sorry for your loss. Zoey was a remarkable patient. Thank you for meeting me. I know this is unusual." She studied me for a moment, her expression careful. "You said on the phone that you had concerns about your daughter's treatment. Can you be more specific?" I had rehearsed this conversation, but now that the moment was here, I struggled to find the right words. "Doctor, did my daughter seem afraid to you in her final months?" Dr. Rodriguez's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "Afraid of what?" "Of her husband. Of making decisions without him. Of being herself." The silence stretched between us. Medical ethics prevented her from saying too much, but I could see something working behind her eyes. Finally, she leaned forward. "Mr. Patterson, I can't discuss specific medical details without proper authorization, but I can tell you that I was concerned about your daughter's psychological state during her treatment." "What kind of concerns?" "She exhibited signs of anxiety that seemed disproportionate to her condition. Her autoimmune disorder was serious but manageable with medication. Yet she seemed to live in constant fear that she was dying, that she was a burden, that she couldn't trust her own judgment about her body." I felt my hands clench around my coffee cup. "Did she always come to appointments alone?" "No. Her husband accompanied her to every single appointment after the first diagnosis. Everyone. He would answer questions directed at her, correct her when she tried to explain her symptoms, and insisted on being present for all private consultations." "Is that normal?" Dr. Rodriguez chose her words carefully. "Supportive spouses often attend appointments, but in 22 years of practice, I've rarely seen someone so controlling of the medical conversation. Your daughter would start to ask a question, and he would interrupt to rephrase it. She would describe a symptom, and he would add details that sometimes contradicted what she had said. The picture was becoming clearer, and it made me sick." "Did you ever get to speak with Zoey alone?" "Once. About 3 months before she died, I managed to speak with her privately when her husband stepped out to move their car. She seemed agitated, kept looking at the door. I asked if everything was all right at home, and she said something that stayed with me." "What did she say?" "She said, 'Doctor, do you think it's possible to love someone so much that you lose yourself completely?' When I asked what she meant, she shook her head and said she was just being dramatic because of her medication." My throat tightened. "What medication for her autoimmune condition?" Dr. Rodriguez hesitated again. "I prescribed medication for her autoimmune disorder, yes, but her husband mentioned that she was also seeing a psychiatrist for anxiety and depression. He said the psychiatrist had prescribed additional medications to help her cope with the stress of her illness." "Did you ever see evidence of these other medications?" "No, and that concerned me. Drug interactions can be serious, especially with autoimmune treatments. I asked for the name of her psychiatrist several times so I could coordinate care, but your daughter always said she would have her husband follow up with that information. The information never came." I stared out the window, watching people walk by with their normal problems, their manageable lives. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, was my daughter being medicated inappropriately?" She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I think your daughter was being controlled in ways that may have been harmful to her physical and mental health. I wish I had pushed harder to get her alone to understand what was really happening at home." After Dr. Rodriguez left, I sat in that coffee shop for hours, pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. Donald hadn't just isolated Zoey from her friends and family. He had been controlling her medical care, possibly medicating her to keep her compliant and dependent. But I needed more than suspicions. I needed proof. The next day I swallowed my pride and called my old business partner, Jim Morrison. We had built our consulting firm together 25 years ago, and he had bought out my share when I disappeared after Zoey's death. Thomas, Jesus, man, where have you been? I've been worried sick. I'm sorry, Jim. Things have been complicated. Look, I know losing Zoey hit you hard, but disappearing like that wasn't the answer. We could have worked something out with the business. I explained my situation as briefly as possible, leaving out the worst details. Jim listened without judgment, which was one of the reasons our partnership had worked so well. I need a favor, I said finally. I need someone to help me investigate my son-in-law. Quietly. Investigate him for what? I think he may have been abusing my daughter. Psychologically, medically. I think he isolated her and then manipulated her into changing her will. Jim was quiet then. That's a serious accusation, Thomas. Do you have any proof? Not yet, but I will. 3 days later, Jim called me back with a name, Rebecca Chen, a private investigator who specialized in domestic abuse cases. She agreed to meet me at a diner in Cambridge, away from Donald's usual haunts. Rebecca was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and an air of competence that immediately put me at ease. Jim explained your situation, she said, sliding a manila folder across the table. I did some preliminary research on Donald Crawford. My hands shook as I opened the folder. Inside were documents I had never seen before: marriage certificates, divorce records, financial statements. Your son-in-law has been married twice before, Rebecca said quietly. Both marriages ended in divorce, both under suspicious circumstances. What kind of circumstances? His first wife, Jennifer, filed for divorce after 2 years, citing emotional and psychological abuse. She withdrew the allegations and settled quickly out of court for a substantial sum. His second wife, Patricia, died in a car accident 6 months after filing for divorce. The blood drained from my face. Died? Single car accident on a rainy night. Patricia had been acting erratically in the weeks before her death, according to friends. She told several people she thought someone was putting something in her food, making her feel confused and disoriented. Oh, I thought about Zoey's mysterious medications, her increased anxiety, her growing dependence on Donald's judgment. Was there an investigation? Minimal. Patricia had a history of mental health issues, depression, anxiety, and had been prescribed several medications. The assumption was that she had either fallen asleep at the wheel or had some kind of medical emergency. Donald inherited a substantial life insurance payout. I stared at the documents, my mind reeling. And Jennifer, the first wife, still alive, living in California. I tracked her down, and she's willing to talk. Off the record, she told me that Donald was a master manipulator. He would convince her that her friends and family were toxic, that only he truly understood her. He monitored her phone calls, controlled their finances, and gradually isolated her from everyone she cared about. How did she get away? Her sister intervened, flew out from New York and literally dragged Jennifer to a lawyer. Jennifer said she was so confused by then, so dependent on Donald's version of reality, that she almost didn't go. Rebecca pulled out another document. There's something else. Donald has a pattern of targeting women with substantial assets. Jennifer was a successful real estate agent. Patricia inherited money from her father, and your daughter had a trust fund worth over $200 million. Exactly. I think Donald is what we call a predatory spouse. He finds vulnerable women with money, marries them, isolates them, and then either divorces them with a favorable settlement or... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Do you think he killed my daughter? Rebecca met my eyes steadily. I think your daughter was in danger, and I think she may have realized it before she died. The question is, what was she planning to do about it? As I walked back to the shelter that night, my mind was spinning with possibilities. Zoey hadn't been the weak, manipulated victim I had imagined. She had been fighting back, gathering information, making plans. But if that was true, then why had she left everything to Donald? Why had she cut me out of her will so completely, unless the will Donald showed me wasn't the real one? The thought hit me like lightning, and suddenly I couldn't wait to talk to Rebecca again. Because if Zoey had discovered Donald's true nature, if she had been planning to leave him or expose him, then she would have protected her assets. She would have protected me. And that meant somewhere out there was the real will, the one Donald didn't know existed. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was standing in line for breakfast at the shelter. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer. "Mr. Patterson, this is Margaret Steinberg from Steinberg, Walsh & Associates. I need to speak with you urgently about your daughter's estate." My heart stopped. "I'm sorry, who is this?" "I was your daughter's attorney. Her real attorney, not the one her husband used for the will he's been showing people." I stepped outside the shelter, my hands trembling. The October air was sharp, cutting through my thin jacket, but I barely felt it. "I don't understand. Donald showed me Zoey's will. She left everything to him." "Mr. Patterson, I need you to come to my office immediately. There are things about your daughter's final months that you need to know. Things that Donald Crawford knows nothing about." Margaret Steinberg's office was in a converted brownstone in Back Bay, the kind of place that whispered old money and discretion. I felt self-conscious walking through the elegant lobby in my donated clothes, but the receptionist treated me with the same courtesy she would show any client. Margaret herself was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that had seen everything. She gestured for me to sit in a leather chair across from her massive mahogany desk. "Your daughter came to see me 6 months before she died," she began without preamble. "She was terrified, Mr. Patterson, not of her illness, but of her husband." I leaned forward, my breath caught in my throat. "What did she tell you?" Margaret opened a thick file folder. She said she had discovered that Donald had been married twice before, and that both marriages had ended badly. She had hired a private investigator and learned about his pattern of isolating and controlling women with money. Did she know about Patricia, his second wife who died? Margaret's eyebrows raised slightly. "You've been doing your own investigation." Yes, she knew. She was convinced that Patricia's death wasn't an accident, and she was terrified she would be next. Then why didn't she leave him? Why didn't she come to me? Margaret's expression softened with sympathy. "She wanted to, but Donald had been very clever. He had convinced her that you were disappointed in her marriage, that you thought she was weak for staying with him. He told her you had said she was making bad decisions because of her medication." The words hit me like a physical blow. I never said any of those things. I barely saw her in those final months. I know, but Donald had isolated her so completely that she believed his version of reality. She thought everyone in her life had given up on her. Everyone except him. Margaret pulled out a document and handed it to me. "This is why she came to me. She wanted to create a new will without Donald's knowledge, but she needed time to plan her escape safely." I stared at the papers in my hands, my vision blurring with tears. It was indeed a will, dated just 8 weeks before Zoey's death. And, according to this document, I inherited everything. She left it all to me. Not exactly. She was smarter than that. She knew that if something happened to her and she had simply cut Donald out, he would contest the will. He would claim she was mentally incompetent due to her illness and medication. So she got creative. Margaret pulled out another set of documents. She created what's called a conditional inheritance. According to this will, Donald inherits everything just as he believes, but only if he meets certain conditions within 90 days of her death. What conditions? He has to submit to a comprehensive background check, including financial records, medical records, and a psychological evaluation. He has to provide documentation of all medications prescribed to your daughter during their marriage, and he has to allow an independent investigation into the circumstances of her death. My mind raced as I processed this information, and if he doesn't meet these conditions, then everything reverts to you. The house, the investments, the trust fund, all $228 million of it. I set the papers down with shaking hands. Does Donald know about these conditions? That's the brilliant part. The will he received and filed with probate court is real. It does leave everything to him. but it references an addendum that was to be provided separately by my office. He thinks the addendum is just routine paperwork about tax implications. Margaret smiled for the first time since I had arrived. Your daughter was much smarter than Donald gave her credit for. She knew he would never agree to those conditions voluntarily because he has too much to hide. So what happens now? Now we wait. The 90-day period expires in 12 days. Donald has made no attempt to fulfill any of the conditions because he doesn't know they exist. On November 15th, I will inform him that he has forfeited his inheritance due to non-compliance with the terms of the will. I felt dizzy with the implications. He'll fight it. He'll claim this is fraud. He can try. But your daughter was very thorough. She documented everything. His controlling behavior, the mysterious medications, the isolation from friends and family. She even recorded several conversations where he admitted to lying about your feelings toward her. Margaret reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small digital recorder. Would you like to hear one of them? I nodded, not trusting my voice. The sound quality was muffled, as if the recorder had been hidden, but I could clearly hear Zoey's voice and Donald's. I should call my dad, Zoey was saying. He probably wants to visit. Why would he want that? Donald's voice was smooth, patient. He told me he finds your illness depressing. He said it reminds him too much of your mother's death. He said that last week when you were sleeping. He called to check on you, but he seemed relieved when I told him you weren't up for visitors. He said he's been very busy with work anyway. I listened in horror as Donald continued to poison my daughter against me with lies I had never spoken. Worse, I could hear Zoey's voice change, becoming smaller, more defeated with each fabrication. Maybe you're right, she said finally. Maybe it's better if I don't bother him. Margaret stopped the recording. She made dozens of these. She was building a case, Mr. Patterson. She was planning to escape. Then what happened? Why did she die before she could leave him? Margaret's expression darkened. That's what the investigation will determine, but I have my suspicions. She pulled out a medical report. 3 days before your daughter died, she called me. She said she had finally worked up the courage to tell Donald she wanted a divorce. But when she tried to have that conversation, he became violent for the first time. He didn't hit her, but he screamed at her, threw things, told her she was too sick and crazy to survive without him. And then her symptoms suddenly got much worse. She became confused, disoriented. She fell down the stairs at home and hit her head. Donald called an ambulance, but by the time they reached the hospital, she had suffered massive brain trauma. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. You think he drugged her. I think he panicked when she threatened divorce. I think he increased whatever medication he had been giving her to keep her compliant, and it caused her to become disoriented and fall. Whether that was intentional murder or criminally negligent homicide, I can't say, but I don't believe it was an accident. I stared out the window at the busy street below, watching normal people living their normal lives, while my world rearranged itself around this terrible knowledge. Why didn't you contact me sooner? Why wait until now? Because your daughter made me promise to wait the full 90 days. She hoped that if she survived, she would be able to contact you herself and explain everything. If she didn't survive, she wanted to give Donald enough rope to hang himself. She was convinced that if he thought he had gotten away with everything, he would get careless. Margaret handed me another folder, and she was right. Since your daughter's death, Donald has been living quite openly with a new woman, a widow named Carol Peterson, who recently inherited $4 million from her late husband's insurance policy. My blood ran cold. He's doing it again. We believe so. And if we can prove what he did to your daughter, we can save Carol Peterson and potentially get justice for Patricia Morrison, his second wife. I looked at all the documents spread across Margaret's desk, evidence of my daughter's intelligence, her courage, her love for me despite Donald's lies. She had died protecting me and trying to protect future victims. What do I need to do? Margaret's smile was sharp as a blade. In 12 days, you're going to become a very wealthy man, Mr. Patterson, and then we're going to make sure Donald Crawford pays for what he did to your daughter. As I left Margaret's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope for justice, but hope that my daughter had never stopped loving me. That despite everything Donald had done to poison her mind, she had seen through his lies in time to protect both of us. But first, I had to survive 12 more days. And something told me that once Donald realized what was happening, those were going to be the most dangerous days of my life. November 15th arrived with the kind of bitter cold that cuts through your bones. I stood outside Margaret Steinberg's office at exactly 9 in the morning, watching my breath form clouds in the frigid air. Today was the day. Today, Donald would learn that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Margaret had insisted I be present when she delivered the news. "Your daughter wanted you to see this moment," she had said. She wanted Donald to know that you knew everything. Inside the warmth of the office, Margaret reviewed the final details with me one more time. The 90-day period had expired at midnight. Donald had made no attempt to fulfill any of the conditions of Zoey's real will because he had no idea they existed. By law, the inheritance now reverted to me. "Are you ready for this?" Margaret asked, her hand hovering over her phone. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The humiliation of being thrown out of my own daughter's house. The nights in the homeless shelter, questioning whether I had been a terrible father. The slow revelation that Donald had systematically destroyed my relationship with Zoey through lies and manipulation. "I'm ready." Margaret dialed Donald's number and put the call on speaker. "Margaret?" Donald's voice came through, crisp and confident. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I thought all the estate paperwork was finalized weeks ago." "I'm afraid there's been a complication, Donald. We need to meet immediately to discuss the conditions of Zoey's will that weren't properly fulfilled." Silence. Then, "What conditions?" "There weren't any conditions. I inherited everything outright." "I'm afraid that's not accurate. Could you come to my office this afternoon, say 2 o'clock? "Margaret, I don't know what game you're playing, but I don't have time for this. The will was clear. Everything goes to me." Margaret's voice remained perfectly professional. "The will was indeed clear, Donald, but you failed to read the fine print. 2 o'clock. Don't be late." He hung up before he could respond. At exactly 2 o'clock, Donald burst through Margaret's office door like a man possessed. He was impeccably dressed as always, but I could see the panic in his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly as he adjusted his tie. "What the hell is this about, Margaret? And why is he here?" Donald's gaze fell on me with pure venom. "Please sit down, Donald," Margaret said calmly. "We have a lot to discuss." "I'll stand. Now explain to me what's going on." Margaret opened the thick file folder and pulled out the real will. "This is what's going on. Your wife created a conditional inheritance. You were named as the primary beneficiary, but only if you met certain requirements within 90 days of her death." Donald snatched the papers from her hands, his eyes scanning the text rapidly. I watched his face change as he read, the color draining from his cheeks. "This is impossible. This isn't legal. She was mentally incompetent when she wrote this. The medications, her illness. Actually, we have extensive documentation proving that Zoey was of sound mind when she created this will," Margaret interrupted, "including psychological evaluations from an independent psychiatrist." "What psychiatrist?" "She was seeing Dr. Hammond for her anxiety." "Dr. Hammond, who has no record of treating your wife for anything other than a single consultation that you scheduled," Margaret said smoothly. "The psychiatrist Zoey was actually seeing was Dr. Sarah Chen, who evaluated her mental competency at her own request." Donald's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "That's impossible. I would have known." "Would you? Just like you knew about the private investigator she hired? Just like you knew about the recordings she made of your conversations?" Margaret pulled out the digital recorder and set it on her desk. Donald stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. "She recorded me?" "Oh, she recorded a lot of things, Donald. Would you like to hear some highlights?" Without waiting for an answer, Margaret pressed play. Donald's own voice filled the room, smooth and persuasive, as he told Zoey that her father had called her a burden, that her friends thought she was becoming too needy, that her doctors were concerned about her mental stability. All lies, all carefully crafted to isolate her from anyone who might help her. "Turn it off," Donald said, his voice barely a whisper. "There's more," Margaret continued, "much more. Conversations where you discussed increasing her medication without her knowledge. Conversations where you planned how to handle her inheritance after she died. Conversations where you admitted to lying to her about her father's feelings. Donald collapsed into the chair across from Margaret's desk, his composure finally cracking. You don't understand. I loved her. Everything I did was to protect her. Protect her from what? From making mistakes, from getting hurt by people who would use her for her money, from her own poor judgment. I couldn't stay silent anymore. Like her poor judgment in loving her own father? Donald's head snapped toward me, his eyes blazing with hatred. You were never there for her. Even when she was dying, you were more concerned with your business than with her. Because you told me she didn't want visitors. I stood up, my voice rising. Because you told me she was too tired to see me. Because you lied about everything. She was better off without you. You would have filled her head with doubts about our marriage, about the decisions we were making together. The decisions you were making for her, Margaret corrected. The medications you were giving her without her knowledge. The friends you drove away with lies. The father you convinced her didn't love her. Donald's mask slipped completely now, revealing the calculating predator beneath. She was going to leave me. Can you believe that? After everything I had done for her, she was going to throw it all away because of some paranoid delusions. Paranoid delusions? I stepped closer to him. You mean like her delusion that you had been married before? Her delusion that your previous wives had died or been intimidated into silence? Donald went very still. What are you talking about? Margaret pulled out another folder. We know about Jennifer Morrison in California. We know about Patricia Crawford, who died so conveniently after filing for divorce. We know about your pattern of targeting wealthy women, isolating them, and then either divorcing them with favorable settlements or what? Or making sure they don't live to see the divorce finalized. Donald laughed, but it was a hollow, desperate sound. You can't prove any of that. Patricia's death was an accident. The police investigated. A very cursory investigation, Margaret agreed. But things have changed since then. New evidence has come to light. Evidence that suggests Patricia was being systematically drugged in the weeks before her death, just like Zoey was. I watched Donald's face as the full implications hit him. He wasn't just losing Zoey's inheritance. He was facing a murder investigation. And where did you get the drugs, Donald? Margaret continued relentlessly. The ones you were slipping into Zoey's food? The ones that made her confused and disoriented? I never drugged her. Her medication was prescribed by her doctor. Which doctor? Dr. Hammond, who has no record of prescribing anything? Or perhaps you forged prescriptions. We'll find out when the police search your house. Donald shot to his feet, his chair toppling backward. You can't search my house. You have no evidence. Actually, we do. Margaret smiled coldly. Zoey hid samples of the food and drinks you gave her during her final weeks. She was much smarter than you gave her credit for, Donald. She suspected what you were doing, and she gathered evidence. The fight went out of Donald like air from a punctured balloon. He slumped against the wall, his expensive suit wrinkled, his perfect hair disheveled. She was going to destroy me, he whispered. Everything I had worked for, everything I had built. She was going to take it all away. So you killed her. It wasn't a question. Margaret's voice was flat, stating a fact. Donald's head snapped up. It was an accident. I gave her a little extra medication to calm her down, to make her more reasonable. I never meant for her to fall down the stairs. The confession hung in the air like poison. I felt my legs give out, and I sank back into my chair. My daughter, my beautiful, intelligent daughter, had been murdered by the man she trusted most. So you admit it, Margaret said quietly. You admit to drugging Zoey without her knowledge, which led directly to her death. Donald seemed to realize what he had just said. No, that's not. I didn't mean you tricked me. I didn't trick you into anything, Donald. I just gave you enough rope to hang yourself, which, coincidentally, is exactly what Zoey predicted you would do. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed a number. Detective Morrison, this is Margaret Steinberg. I have that confession we discussed. Yes, he's here now. No, I don't think he'll be going anywhere. Through the office window, I could see police cars pulling up outside. Margaret had planned this perfectly, just as Zoey had planned her revenge from beyond the grave. Donald looked around the room like a trapped animal, his eyes wild with panic. "This isn't over! I'll fight this! I'll prove that Zoey was mentally incompetent. I'll prove that you coerced her into changing her will." "You're welcome to try," Margaret said calmly. "But I should warn you, Zoey left one final surprise for you." She pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. "She wanted you to have this after you confessed. Consider it her final goodbye." Donald's hands trembled as he broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. I watched his face as he read, saw the exact moment when he realized that Zoey had outmaneuvered him completely. "What does it say?" I asked. Margaret smiled. "Why don't you read it aloud, Donald? Share Zoey's final words with her father." But Donald couldn't speak. He just stood there, the letter shaking in his hands, as the police entered the office to arrest him for murder. The letter from Zoey lay on Margaret's desk like a sacred document. Donald had dropped it when the police handcuffed him, his face a mask of defeat and disbelief. As they led him away, he kept looking back at me with a mixture of hatred and something that might have been fear. "Would you like to read it now?" Margaret asked gently, after the commotion had died down and we were alone in her office. I picked up the letter with trembling hands. Zoey's handwriting was as beautiful as I remembered, each letter carefully formed, despite what must have been tremendous emotional turmoil when she wrote it. "My dearest Dad," I read aloud, my voice breaking on the first words. "If you are reading this, it means that Donald has finally shown his true face, and my plan has worked. I need you to know that I never stopped loving you, not for a single moment, despite what he tried to make me believe." I had to stop, overwhelmed by emotion. Margaret handed me a tissue and waited patiently. "I discovered the truth about Donald 6 months before my death," I continued. "The private investigator I hired found evidence of his previous marriages, including what really happened to Patricia. I realized then that I was not his first victim, and I would not be his last unless I stopped him." The letter went on to detail everything Zoey had discovered. How Donald had been gradually increasing her anxiety medication, making her dependent and confused. How he had systematically turned her against everyone she loved by fabricating conversations and situations. How he had convinced her that her own perceptions were unreliable, that only he could guide her through her illness. But the worst part, Dad, was how he used your love for me against both of us. He told me you were ashamed of my weakness, that you thought I was a burden. He told me you had said I was just like Mom, too fragile to handle real life. I believed him because I was scared and sick and desperately wanted to believe that someone understood me. I closed my eyes, remembering my late wife, Sarah. She had struggled with depression and anxiety, and I had tried so hard to be supportive while often feeling helpless. Donald had twisted that history, used my deepest insecurities against both Zoey and me. "I realized too late that every story he told me about you was a lie," the letter continued. "When I finally worked up the courage to call you directly, to test whether his stories were true, you were exactly the father I remembered. Loving, worried, eager to help. That's when I knew I had to act." Margaret leaned forward. "Keep reading. This is the part that will interest you most." I couldn't simply leave Donald or change my will openly. He had convinced everyone, doctors, friends, even some family members, that I was mentally unstable due to my medication. If I tried to divorce him or cut him out of my inheritance, he would have me declared incompetent. But I found a better way. I looked up at Margaret. "We planned all of this, every detail. Your daughter was brilliant, Thomas. She knew exactly how to trap him." The letter explained Zoey's strategy. She had secretly recorded hundreds of hours of conversations, documenting Donald's lies and manipulation. She had saved samples of the food and drinks he gave her, suspecting he was altering her medication. She had created the conditional will as a trap, knowing Donald would never submit to the required background checks because he had too much to hide. Most importantly, Dad, I documented everything he told me about you, every lie, every cruel fabrication designed to make me doubt your love. I want you to know that even in my darkest moments, when I was most confused and afraid, a part of me never believed him completely. A daughter knows when her father loves her, and I always knew you loved me. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I forced myself to continue reading. If my plan works, Donald will confess to his crimes in his own words. He is arrogant and believes himself smarter than everyone else. When cornered, he will lash out and reveal his true nature. By the time you read this, I hope he is facing justice, not just for what he did to me, but for what he did to Patricia and what he would have done to future victims. The final paragraph was addressed specifically to Donald, though he would never read it now. Donald, if you are reading this over my father's shoulder, know that you underestimated me from the very beginning. You thought I was weak, controllable, too naive to see through your manipulation. But I was stronger than you knew, and I loved my father more than you could destroy. You wanted to isolate me from everyone who truly cared about me. But love doesn't die just because you poison it with lies. In the end, that love was your downfall. I set the letter down, my hands shaking. She sacrificed herself to stop him. She saved herself and saved you, Margaret corrected. And she saved Carol Peterson, the woman Donald was already targeting. When we contacted Carol with evidence of Donald's pattern, she immediately broke off their relationship and cooperated with the investigation. Over the following weeks, the full scope of Donald's crimes came to light. The police found the medication he had been using to drug Zoey, along with evidence linking him to Patricia's death. His confession in Margaret's office, combined with Zoey's recordings and documentation, built an ironclad case. Jennifer Morrison, his first wife, flew in from California to testify about the psychological abuse she had endured. Carol Peterson provided evidence of Donald's attempt to isolate her from her family and control her finances. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Donald's trial was swift. Faced with overwhelming evidence, his lawyers advised him to plead guilty in exchange for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He would never hurt another woman again. I used a portion of Zoey's inheritance to establish a foundation in her name dedicated to helping victims of domestic abuse and financial exploitation. Margaret helped me structure it so that it would continue operating long after I was gone, a permanent legacy of my daughter's courage and intelligence. The rest of the money sat largely untouched. I had returned to work, starting a small consulting practice that gave me purpose and kept me busy. I bought a modest house in Cambridge. Nothing fancy, but it had a beautiful garden where I could sit and remember Zoey as she truly was. Not the frightened, isolated woman Donald had tried to create, but the brilliant, loving daughter who had outsmarted a predator and saved both of us. 6 months after Donald's conviction, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photo I had never seen before. Zoey, at maybe 25, laughing at something off camera, her eyes bright with joy and mischief. On the back, in her handwriting, were the words, "For Dad," who taught me that love is stronger than fear. I later learned that Zoey had left the photo with Margaret's instructions to send it to me after everything was resolved. Even from beyond the grave, she was taking care of me, making sure I remembered her happiness rather than her pain. That photo sits on my mantel now, next to one of us together when she was 12, building a sandcastle on Cape Cod. In both pictures, she is smiling, the real smile of a daughter who knew she was loved, not the careful, guarded expression she wore during those final, terrible months with Donald. I visit her grave every Sunday, bringing fresh flowers and updates about the foundation. I tell her about the women we've helped, the predators we've exposed, the lives we've saved because of her courage. I tell her that her plan worked perfectly, that justice was served not through violence or public spectacle, but through her own brilliant mind and careful preparation. Most importantly, I tell her that I understand now what she meant in her final letter. Love doesn't die just because someone tries to poison it with lies. The bond between a father and daughter, built over years of shared jokes and bedtime stories and quiet moments of understanding, is stronger than any manipulation. Donald thought he could erase me from Zoey's life, make her forget that I loved her. But he was wrong. In the end, that love was exactly what destroyed him. On quiet evenings, when I sit in my garden watching the sunset, I sometimes feel Zoey's presence. Not in any supernatural way, but in the peace that comes from knowing that she never stopped loving me, never stopped fighting for us both. She found a way to reach across death itself to give me back my life, my dignity, and the truth about who we were to each other. That's a gift worth more than $228 million. That's a gift that no predator, no matter how cunning, could ever take away. Donald is in prison now, where he will remain for the rest of his life. He lost everything, his freedom, his reputation, his ability to hurt innocent women. But I gained something precious, the knowledge that my daughter's love for me was stronger than his hatred, smarter than his manipulation, and more enduring than his cruelty. In the end, Zoey had the last word, and it was a word of love.